Okay, so title of the session, as it says on your screen, I think is getting better control of your shop floor. I think this has been a repeated topic in my 20-odd years, understanding what's going on out there, getting more and more information. What we're going to cover once we've got through the first start of planning is really principles, things we're trying to achieve. Then we'll go through the planning, which is basically starting to discover what our demand is, looking at how we can track that back to whether it's sales orders, whether it's we're manufacturing subcomponents and we've got lead times that we've got to supply for the master component, all the way through to then scheduling that. So I think a lot of production scenarios we end up juggling to try and fit everything in. It seems to be either a situation of feast or, I guess at the moment, a little bit of famine for a lot of people, but hopefully that'll come back in the not too distant future. And then we'll look at some of the kind of technology that we can put out on the shop floor in your production environment to kind of capture information real time. You can't plan unless you know what the current situation is. Have you achieved the plan to date? And really the situation where you're only getting information 24 hours or sometimes several days out of date doesn't allow you then to react in time and take advantage of the principles. We'll have a quick summary and we'll go on a Q&A. But if anybody wants to be brave enough to turn their mute off and ask a question as we go along, please do that. So the principles really, it's trying not to be too fixed. And I know every production planner certainly would like to make a plan and stick to it rigidly, because that's easy, right? But business isn't like that these days. So agility, being able to stop that, turn that on. You know, customers do change their minds these days, particularly at the moment, and you've got to be able to react. And consequently, planning cycles, we're seeing them coming down. You know, certainly in times gone past, it used to be quite common to have a weekly planning cycle, fix your production plan against that, and not really deviate from that. Now we're seeing people running the planning cycle multiple times a day. Once an hour is one particular client that I go to and consult with. And you know, they're really looking at what's changed since the last time I did that. Now, you can only do that if you've got reliable information about what's happened already from both sides of the fence, from the demand side of the cycle, but also the production side of the cycle. Efficiency is critical. You don't have an army of people who can constantly watch this and look at it. You really need a system to really tell you what you need to look at next and respond for you. So, you know, how automatic can we make it, given that we also have to have, it has to be clever enough to apply the kind of complex rules of doing what you would have done. And somebody who's been there for years and years will just know what the right thing to do is. Getting a system to do that can take a little bit of time and effort. Visualization, so in effect you can understand what it's telling you to do and why, and be able to track from one end of the system to the other, I think is a key thing that we see. Systems that just tell you to do something and you don't understand the background behind that. That's something that Business Central's got progressively better at. Actually, over the last 10 years, the traceability through, they've refined some of the inquiry screens, some of the parameters, some of the way you can track through. You have to have good process, you know, running any system like this, unless you have people who, quote unquote, follow the rules, you're not probably going to be successful, and you're going to spend more time following up queries. but that's where it making it easy for them to follow the rules. And if you give them now the right equipment and the right kind of technology, people are very used to that. Again, if I go back a decade, the idea of putting things like handheld terminals out onto the shop floor used to get clients on a regular basis say, people won't cope with that. Actually, that's not true anymore. Everybody on that shop floor has got a smartphone. Everybody, successfully uses lots of different apps, and this is just another one. And actually, these days, they expect that to be the case. Now, the beauty of that is that we can get some lovely information about what they're doing, how long they've been doing it for, and we can really stop guessing about what's going on and start making correct judgments. So the first piece in this jigsaw is the planning cycle in Business Central. And, planning is lost count of the number of clients I've been to who've run the planning worksheet, as I'm going to demonstrate in a moment. And it's come up with what they would describe as a load of crap. So many lines on there. They don't understand where they're coming from. It's not got the right to consolidation. So it's saying have 8 different production orders when they think there should be 1. It's trying to schedule into the past. And all of this is I'm afraid, down to the data. So you can get a good planning process that will give you just the information you need, what you need, but it does require several things. One of them is accurate dates on being maintained on sales and purchase orders. And so that's a great place to start. If you've got a sales order that says there's an outstanding quantity and it should have been satisfied 3 months ago, guess what? Your planning cycle is going to say, make this production order in the past, okay, and have a real problem with that. So what you need to do is you need to say your customer service and your purchasing people need to be on top of those dates and reviewing. And actually, if you get into the habit of doing that on a daily basis, what should have been delivered, yesterday, first thing every morning, when is it going to be delivered? Actually changing them and making them correct or more useful to the planning system is much more is actually not too difficult to do. Similarly, on the purchase side, if you've got a purchase order for a component that again has an outstanding quantity, and it might just be a balance. They've delivered 90 instead of the 100 you ordered, but that 10 balance is due in 3 weeks ago. Then the system is going to think, well, that's due in today or any day now because it's still a balance. So actually keeping your primary data in terms of your sales and purchase is key importance here. Your items configured correctly is the next place to go. If you've got multiple locations, the system supports stock keeping units. There is a whole set of parameters for each location. So if you have multiple production sites, it may be you produce different things at the different sites. Well, it can cope with that. It's not perhaps under the remit of this particular session, but you can set up to transfer to the one. But if you manufacture at multiple sites or procure at multiple sites, then you need to set the parameters per location, and that's down on the stock keeping unit. But things like the replenishment system, the reordering policy, lot accumulation periods. Lot accumulation periods is a lovely one. I really like that. If you have demand on multiple days, so you've got sales that are due out on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And what the lot accumulation period will do is pull all of that demand through. So it just for Monday, if you put in, for instance, 1 week into lot accumulation period. And that's usually useful because in a production scenario, you don't want to put perhaps every item on production for every day. You want to make 1 batch per week and have enough to satisfy the week. So understanding those fields is key and probably the single most biggest factor to getting your planning worksheet right. And it comes back to the system has to be up to date. The final point, understanding what the situation is right now. You know, if you've had a production order out on the shop floor and it's done 2 days production and is actually 90% through, but they haven't booked any output, the system will think, okay, we need to start that. You know, we'll reschedule to start from now and block capacity going forward, because it doesn't know what the work in progress is. So getting them to actually book on a regular basis. And that's where the technology really comes in, because if they've got to fill in the paperwork and pass that back into the office, somebody's got to pick that up and post that on the system, that's probably not going to happen. And so you're always going to have that factor where the short term, at least, is out of requirement. Let's have a quick look. So let's look at some of the factors around production on Business Central and where they are. And I'll start off with an item. So I've just set up a quick filter just to look at the bicycle parts. Let's look at the atypical Cronus bicycle. So your replenishment system is the first place. How are you typically going to supply that? That's the default policy. It's not the one you can choose. For instance, this time I'm going to buy it if you don't have capacity when you come later in the planning cycle. Few things, your routing and bombs are obviously key. There's some factors on routing that typically not everybody understands. The flushing method of how that, if it's a component going in, is also key to set. But let's go down a bit further. I've set these up to lot for lot. So I get some demand on multiple sales orders, for argument's sake, and I make one production batch just to satisfy that demand in this instance, because I wanted to keep it quite tight. But you have got maximum quantity and fixed reorder quantity on there. Maximum quantity manufactures up to a level, and fixed reorder quantity will get down to a level and reorder as a batch you define after that. Order is interesting in terms of it will create a separate production order every time you get demand. So if you've got 3 different sales orders in a day, it will create 3 production orders all for that same item, and can be quite useful for where you want customization. There's the lot accumulation period that I talked about. So I've set it for a 2-week. The other parameters are pretty much around here. One of the points that I would do is in the latest Business Central, you can hover over a particular thing and it gives you what we call a tooltip, which is quite useful to kind of give you a prompt. And then I don't know if you can see the little URL at the bottom, but the learn more will then take you off to the document site, online help, and give you a fuller explanation of quite a lot of the fields. So you can get more. The other thing is showing more, so it drops things down. So things like time buckets, order multiples, overflow levels all come into this. Your dampener quantities, so when dampener quantity is around saying reschedule. So if the date changes on your sales order, how much can the quantity change before it actually changes the quantity on the production order, etc. So you've got some flexibility about going down that. So it's really about getting those right will cause the next area to we're going to look at to get right. So the planning worksheet is the primary tool for running what a lot of people will recognise as an MRP MPS run. So I'm going to calculate a quick regenerative plan. I haven't made this all neat and tidy because I wanted some anomalies to actually be able to show you. I'm running it for one particular category, so the category code that I put all the bike stuff into, with a little wildcard on the end there, and for one set location and a date up until. So I'm only looking at demand up until the end of May from my start date in this instance. I'm doing it for both demand and material requirements. So I'll quickly run that. How long does this take to run? Well, depends on how many items you've got and how many demand. It does cycle through because it has to go through all levels for instance, if you've got multiple levels of subassembly. So, I've known that take 20 minutes, but that was an extreme situation where I think we had 16 levels of bill of material over something like 18,000 items. So again, there's some tuning we can do around the filters to try and make that quicker. We can also schedule it these days so that actually it runs in background and it just updates so that when you come into it, it's already being calculated. So here we've got a list of demand, and if I scroll across, I knock my resolution down so you can see a little bit easier. We've got a number of recommendations to purchase, and we've got a number of recommendations to make. And this is where you can go on and actually change, what the policy is. So we could revert from one to the other if we wanted to. There are a lot more columns that I could turn on, and typically would as well, to show, for instance, if I'm buying it, who I'm buying it from, and even the price and so on. So I can work everything from here, or I can just recommend a purchase. And when I've said, actually, I do want all of those rims on those specific dates, I can then pass that across to a purchase requisition for the purchasing team to go purchase if I need to. I won't spend too much time on here because I think this is probably the area that most people do use. One of the things I will do is just go show the order tracking. So this is where the tracking back to the different sales orders that this demand has come from. And from here, I can see 7 different sales orders. I could go and click on, actually, there's one with 4 different lines on. I could go show, and I could see I'd created a sales order with some different lines on. Come on. There we go. If I track across, you'll see I deliberately set different days of the week for the planned shipment day. And it's pulled all of those together. So that's where it's pulling that lot accumulation period just to make the quantity it needs in one batch, which is probably the single most thing that people don't necessarily get right, and have too many lines on here. So you can see the action message as well. If it thinks you're making it for the wrong date, here I've got an original production order date of the 1st of May, and it thinks that actually I don't need it till the 4th, so I could put that back a bit. I was originally going to make 25, actually only need 24, so reduce it by 1. And that's where that dampener quantity, if I'd set that to 10, I'd just have a change date. If I'd set the dampener period to a week, I wouldn't actually see that line on there at all. So again, that's about setting those parameters so that it doesn't work. Dampener period is interesting. If it pulls it, if the demand is later, it will ignore it. If the demand comes forward, so you need it earlier, it will still show it. It only does the dampeners on the where things are going backwards or less. So at this point, I can choose to accept these different ones. I've got some of them, and they accept the ones with the tensions. You go click on the message again, it tells you, the start date is before today. Clearly, that's not a valid thing to do, so it doesn't default to those. But where I want to, I can go and carry out message, and I can create firm plan production orders. I can make, as I said, a requisition worksheet, or make the production purchase orders directly from there. I won't do that for now. While I'm in here, we'll just go and look at production capacity. So we have 2 main areas for production. One is the work center, which is sorry, I picked the wrong one off the list. So work centers are groups of machines. So things like a department, that could be welding, it could be cutting, it could be CNC, wherever. Within a work center, we typically have one or more machine centers. So the machine centers are the individual production components. Typically, you'll sometimes set your routing so it goes through a work center, and then when you come to actually plan schedule this particular job, you'll decide which machine it's going on. And that's where we've added a capability into Business Central for alternatives. So we can say machine 1 is the fastest machine. Machine 2 actually is a little bit older, and thereby when we put that standard time on it for that production order, we need to actually multiply it by maybe another 10% because it's 10% slower than our first machine. Lots of options here. Specifically scheduling, you've got to decide how you schedule, whether you schedule in minutes, what your capacity is. We have an efficiency. So do we schedule 100% of time, or do we just schedule one? We have a shop calendar, so we can go and define, I won't go into it, but we can define the start dates and the end dates. And what that allows us to do is see loading for a particular area on a particular day. So we have 1,440 minutes, and I've got no capacity on here right now. Let's scroll up. There you see. So suddenly I start to see that actually on 30th of the 4th, 2020, I have an issue because I have a loading of 133%. So clearly I've got to go and pull something forward and make it a little bit more sensible. But that's we define that capacity. We've got start time and end time. So here it's just a single shift of 8 till 4 that we've defined, and we can do a capacity of 3. So we've got 3 capabilities at the same time. And the reason we've got 3, if I go back and just look at machine center, is I've got 3 100s. So all of these people in this instance, but they can be machines, are defined as part of that work center. So they're all part of work center 100. And so there you can see why I've got capacity of 3, because I have 3 individual people or 3 individual machines that can work in that work center. So that's where we start to go. Just while I'm in here, I'll look at some of the other factors, save us coming down a little better. And we have this section at the bottom, which is manufacturing execution system. So that's what that's the trendy term these days for how we collect information from the shop floor, which we're going to look at in a little while. And we can see some of the parameters here, and I'll talk about these about whether we prompt for which is the next production order they want to work on, or whether we have it automatic, so it automatically moves, gives them the next one we want to do, whether it shows in the manufacturing execution system or not, or whether it's just a routing that we go through, that we flush through because we want to include some cost for it, or we don't actually have terminals in that section because it's not worth capturing. You don't typically capture information about what's happened at every stage. Usually it's just it's kind of the bottlenecks. They're the key ones that you need to capture. Things like confirming the operator. If you've got machines, you might want to know the particular operator. Why might that be useful? Well, you might find that actually you're much closer to the standard times on one particular machine when a particular operator is working it. When he goes on holiday, she goes on holiday, and somebody else stands in, then you don't get quite the efficiency. So you can capture that because, as I said a little bit earlier, we do capture actual times in terms of how this works. So all of those kind of components come together, and we end up with a production order. So I'll look at release production orders. We have firm planned. It's what we were going to create off the planning worksheet. So we have actually simulated, planned, firm planned, and released. So you could have, for instance, released might be production orders you're working on this week. Firm planned might be your firm plan for next week or next couple of days, depending on your planning cycle. And planned and simulated might be way out in the future, a lot less firm. So typically we're deleting the planned orders and recreating them as demand changes. But once we get to firm planned, we're probably buying components against firm planned, and we're actually executing release production orders. So what does a production order in Business Central look like? Well, those of you who are used to nav will recognize a lot of this. We have the component that's going to be produced. Down on the line, we have the components that it's expected to use and where we're at. We have a whole bunch of different things that we can do against that, whether the flushing method is manual or is forward or back flushed. So back flushed will just say if you use one each time, a tire, if I set the tire to back flushed, then we make 10 bicycles, we will back flush, or sorry, we make 10 front wheels, we will back flush 10 tires out. So saves you booking those components, and it will book them out of the bin that production area is in. So you can do what I've done here, which is already pick some of the items into this particular area. So we've kitted up what we need for these production orders and delivered it from the warehouse to the production area. Again, warehousing that comes in really with some of the WMS capabilities that we have in Business Central. There's a few things that we've added in here. We can add capability to produce byproducts. So if you produce an item, and sometimes when it's not quite good enough, maybe a quality issue, you produce a secondary item, or you actually make one and you produce an offcut, something like that we can do. We can talk about substitutions. And this one is a key one. I haven't calculated this, but earliest material availability date. Trying to schedule something before you've actually got the material. So going and looking at the purchase orders that you've got due in, when's the earliest you could start this? Because when would we have the items we need? We can go and run a routine that calculates that and shows us exactly what we need for that process. So again, on the line, just the opposite side, really, we've got the routing. What are the particular areas it's done? Again, there's a few different things that we've added onto this. So we've added alternate routing sets. That's where I'm saying you could actually define where you can move this if you want to. So if it makes sense. We've also added a few bits in terms of the number of operators for running and the number of operators for setup. So sometimes if you have a machine that requires tooling to be fitted, you may require 2 operators at that machine. Well, those 2 operators, if that fitter is on that machine at that point, it can't be on a different machine fitting that as well. So in effect, we might want to set the operators on setup then. And we can also see if it's actually being picked up by any device, etc. Another one that's a key for me is the quantity available to start. So I've actually done the first operation through the first op here. So I've got 50 where I can start the second operation because they completed the first operation. I think it's really strange for Business Central. It doesn't have that capability as standard. So it will just show you a routing line, a production requirement, despite the fact that you haven't got the material and you haven't done the previous operation. We've actually fixed this so that effectively it will only show you things that you can start, which is a pretty key component. So I guess I should go back and talk a little about scheduling. So let me just run that on. I've done that. So scheduling. So once you have your capacity set up in your machine centers and your work centers, You can set some machine centers to finite capacity and have others for infinite. But a lot of companies these days set everything to infinite and then cope with it. They do what I just did, which is look at the percentage loading and go 133, that's not possible. What are we going to juggle? What overtime are we going to add? And how are we going to move things around? The alternative routing set, putting it on a machine that you don't normally use, but you can use where you need to, is a classic use for that. We talked about earliest availability lists, and I'm going to criticize Business Central and say its lists with just start dates and times are not particularly friendly. So this is where I think you should really consider, if you're going to use Business Central in a production environment, think about adding a graphical scheduler. And that's what I'm actually going to show you kind of what that looks like now. So graphical scheduling. We have what we call production simulations. So every time you plan, you're in effect, there's a, the planning cycle is, first of all, you determine what you need to plan, what you need to get done. And then you look at that and you go, what's the best order to do it in? Now, if while you're doing the second, the first one changes, then that can be pretty catastrophic. So we've got, I've got two simulations here, two planning cycles, if you like. I can see the first one's outdated. So since we started that process, more demand has gone on, or some production orders have been changed, etc., etc. So therefore, that simulation is not valid. I can go and create a new simulation. What this does, it goes and looks at every production order that you've got in progress or planned, and what areas of the factory you want to plan. So it's a quick process. And then I can go and do my earliest material availability date allocations. So I can then go and run for that and go and set those dates to look at on a priority and first in, first out basis, what material we're going to have for what production order. And then I come into something like, this is the graphical scheduler. So when I hover over the different production orders that I need to do, it can tell me, you can define what it shows there. You can define different items as different colors. That was one of the things I could set against the simulation, but I can actually go and change the color mode. So I could go and change it to, for instance, see a production order view, or a progress view, or an availability view. So things like a progress view will turn the ones that are late or going to be late, they are after their due date, red, because clearly those are the ones I need to try and juggle into the right order. Things like an availability view are ones where, for instance, it would turn them red if we're trying to do a manufacturing process before the material view. Yeah, let's just should we swap it into a view. Haven't got the colours set against the work set. Let's swap it back to item. Okay, so there. So now I'm literally in a situation where I'm dragging and dropping them onto the order. You'll see right on the right hand side, I've got this grey area, and that is because I shouldn't drop it after that, because that means I'm going to be late for that production. So I can set the curtains. I've also set it so that these are the production orders that it's valid to drop on. I can control which areas I could actually drop this particular work on, so that I'm not actually dropping a job onto a machine center that's not actually valid to do it. When I do that, it will schedule the subsequent operations, and you see it lines up effectively what needs to happen when. I might go and try and slot that in now, and it's dropped that in, and again I'm pulling down from standby different jobs to get that in. And then if I'm going to try and slot that in there, in effect, it's going to push those along to slot it in a gap. So consequently, I'm loading up Mike quite substantially. I should put a thing on Brian as well. And there I can start to see, oh, I haven't scheduled the first operation. I've scheduled a subsequent one. So, does that make logical sense in terms of that? If I go and click on one of these, I can start to see that it's highlighted that actually, that we have an issue with that. So the color coding, etc. So in terms of getting things to happen in the right order, much easier than just trying to work out if one start time is lower than the other. When we drop that down, I can actually see now for this particular work center, the loading in terms of where I've dragged and dropped it is below the maximum. So I haven't overloaded everything, which is probably right given the gaps that I've got in terms of dropping things out of standby. So lots of capability in this in terms of looking at it per day, per week, per month. You can, I can make it bigger, I can make it smaller very quickly to drag it in. I can have it just for one set of production orders. I can apply standard routing. So if I've moved things around, I can go back to the standard routing if I want to. Lots of capability to kind of try what if scenarios with this. And then when I close that, it sets back to that simulation. I could go and try and start another one if I wanted to. But what I should do once I'm happy with that simulation is publish it. So I've got everything in the right order, arranged in the right way. Let me just make that bigger for you again. And once I'm happy with it, that's where I go publish and drive it out so that that's fully what's going to happen. So I hope you see that we've started to get quite a nice tool. The graphical scheduler is constantly improving. I think every quarter for the last year, I've seen different things added to that as we get different. There's different suggestions. Tool from Netronic, really great tool. We've cooperated with Netronic in creating some of the capability of that and a really strong production. To give you an instance, release production orders, this is the kind of view you get. You can either look at it a production order and you're seeing start date, end date. The other option that you've got within Business Central, if I just go to back to the work center, give me the work center list. That's it. And if I go into that assembly department again, what I can do is, where is it? Navigate. Planning. I've got task list. So again, this just gives you, in effect, the work to list. But again, you see start times and end times and understanding kind of how they fit together and where they butt up. It's not the friendliest view to look at, particularly in a real life planning scenario where you've got probably several thousand tasks on this to sort it into order and understand where you've got capability or where you've got gaps. Not great. So that's why we suggest that tool. Okay. Let me just. So then we get to the shop floor. I talked about this a little bit already, talking about kind of touchscreens or portable devices. Where would we use one? What do I mean by a touchscreen? Well, actually, I mean, atypically, it can be just a cheap tablet. So, I don't know if Tesco do their own brand anymore. I remember seeing them in Tesco's for about £80, where you could buy a kind of 7-inch Wi-Fi connected tablet. You don't need wiring. You just need a USB cable for some power. And as long as it has a web browser, we can get to it. Where people are working on the top floor, typically keyboards don't work very well because there's the space for them, or that they get in the way. So they just want something up on the machine or on a stand on the wall. You can buy the little ruggedized cases for the tablets, and actually it's a fairly cheap, fairly redundant way, not hugely expensive way of publishing the information real time out to the shop floor. The handheld terminals, I'm talking about, barcode devices, but these days you can use your phone. If it's an Android phone, you can use that, and I'll show you a little bit around that. So let's just go back to looking at some examples. We're really telling the people on the shop floor what they need to look at next, to what they need to do next, trying to give them all instructions that they need, so that in effect we eliminate the need for paperwork out there. And you can sit in a production office and schedule a production order and say, this is the next job that's got to go on machine 2, and the next time machine 2 finishes what they're on now, it'll come up with that particular production order. So let's go have a look again, shall we? So what's an MES screen look like? So I'll start on this one, probably there. I logged this on, ready for this session, and started a production order for Mike. You remember he was the first person in that first production order. All of these boxes are configurable, so we can show exactly the piece of information that they wanted. And I didn't set it up on the routing, but I can actually set a link that will appear on the right-hand side, which takes them to the work instructions for this particular assembly, this particular operation. So if you have drawings or you have work instructions, and so many times I've walked around the shop floor and seen a folder of sometimes laminated, sometimes the plastic wallets, and they've got kind of all of the work instructions that your quality system says that you need and need to be referred to by the shop floor. Those can be accessible via a click of a button from here. When I set this up almost 2 hours ago now, because down at the bottom here, I've got Mike, and you'll see the little clock is ticking on. He's been on this operation for 1 hour, 56 minutes now. So he's not actually doing very well. What we should probably do is ask him why he hasn't booked any output for a while. So what I can do is I can go and click the stop again with my finger. And what it then comes up and says a reason why I've stopped. And maybe at this stage, I don't know. I just haven't done any output. So I'm going to click needs further investigation and click OK. And that's now, in effect, put a stop code onto that particular machine. And you notice that we have a visual kind of aid for people on the shop floor where the background has gone red. Now, that is controllable, but that's deliberate, because if you've got a terminal that's on the side of a machine and you're doing a shop floor inspection, you walk down, you can see from a distance that that particular machine is stopped, and you can then consequently ask why or wander over. I've even got one customer who looks out the window and can see the colour from the fair distance. So we use that as a kind of one of the ideas. When the machine is running, it's green, and typically when it's in setup, it can be blue. So we can go and start again, and if I go and start, it then asks us a reduce list, because we should know, and I can just say I've got a very simple list here, but you can set those up and have whatever reasons you want. Hit that with a finger, and I'm back running again. And at this point, I might decide I've made 3 more bikes. So, output. And so I can see my quantity completed is 8, and, my quantity remaining is 12. my time reverts, so it's actually allocated that 2 hours to those 3 bikes. Somebody's going to look at that and say what went wrong with those when we go look at the capacity ledger entries. We can go and scrap, so we could scrap something directly from this. We can output byproducts. We can see the components that are required, and if any of them were tracked, we could log the serial numbers against it. Again, it's very spread out, and that's deliberately, so you can't see me touching the screen here, but it's finger friendly. So I can go and pick a particular one and say post them in guards or whatever. I won't do that. I'll go back. Just looking at, this was one work center was already running. If I go back, you know, for a machine center, sorry, that's allowed to choose what it does next, I could refresh this list here, and going to Brian Walton, you can set it so that they're fixed to a particular machine center, or you can allow them to select which one they're working on at the time. And now it's come up, and you know, that production order where we've now output 8 of the first operation, I've got operation 2 to do here. So I've got 8 that I can start of a total of 20. So again, if you've got going from one machine to the next, as soon as that first machine's done a set batch and output them, we assume that if there's no wait time, that the second machine can carry on. And so we can select that. Next. And I'm then in, and this is where I'm blue because I have a setup time on the routing. And I'm started to run that, and I'll go and start that and clock into what is happening as I go through. And so again, my little timer has started at the bottom. I'll stop it and say, this time I'll say setup complete. So I've actually done a really quick setup time there, and I'm now going to start the runtime. You can set that so it's automatically, as soon as you finish the setup time, you start the runtime. So again, my clock is complete. For the third one, Linda Mitchell, this is where I said you can set it up so you have sequence control. So typically on the first operation, you know, this is where you want to really control tightly what they start. And if you hand out a set of, you know, even a work to list or a set of paper instructions out to the shop floor, you do find occasionally they pick the one they want to do rather than the one that you're desperate for them to do. So this is where you can set it that first operation. It doesn't give you the list of production orders. It just tells you this is the one I want you to start. And if you don't start it, you know, I can then scrap that because I can go stop, and I can say, in effect, I'm unable to complete it. So I could go and say, for whatever reason, I can't start that one. And typically that's then where we ask for them to detail some notes, and that might be one of a list of reasons, or it might actually be free form. We can again capture some notes from the shop floor, or occasionally these days we're capturing pictures as well, which is a nice switch. So having shown you kind of that, the touchscreen technology, and I hope it's relatively okay for people, I'm just now going to connect and show you, I've got an emulation here. Oh, that's a bit big. Different screens on different resolutions. So I'll just shrink that down and excuse me a second. So what I have here is a little barcode scanning device. Maybe I should turn the camera on for a second and just show you that I've got a handheld device designed to sit on your arm. And then you've got the scanner that is a separate device that sits on your finger. So, you know, there's different ones that you can buy, or as I say, you can use a phone I'm using this particular device, and this is actually using our handheld stuff. And what I'm going to do is come down to the manufacturing area. And what I thought I'd do by contrast there is just go and book some production consumption to show you how that works. So again, if we've got a production order number that we're booking consumption to, let me just go back to Business Central and look up one, and I'll book this front wheel, and just so that you can see how real time this is, I'll pull up the component list. Okay, and then go back. I'm running out of time, I can see. So WO, I could scan this in. I haven't set the barcodes up. That's the one. Oh, wrong. So then what's my component? Well, I'll go 1150 quickly. And it tells me that that's a front hub. And I'm going to look, and I need 100. So in this instance, I'll just book 10. And at the end, you've got an optional whether we say post or not. I've just set it so you could see the information. I haven't picked the 10. I've picked the wrong production order, unfortunately. So yeah, that's not going to work, and I don't really think I've got time to go pick them. But you get the idea that you can just very quickly, and the handheld terminals work, for people who are booking. Quite often the time they're moving around, so they're actually traveling around a series of some racking or a stores situation. So actually having something they can carry with them actually makes much more sense than actually having a fixed kind of tablet. Carrying a tablet doesn't really work because you have to carry it in both hands, and you have to keep putting it up, picking it up and putting it down. So apologies for that. Not quite sure why that didn't go through. Well, I picked the wrong one. I got the wrong data. I should have perhaps noted down which one I wanted to do. But that's how you book components. Finally, I'd just like to go and look at go back to the bicycle, which I think we've done. If I go and look at, I've done some output on so in effect I've done some output. So what the reason I'm coming into here is I'm going into order, and I'm looking at the entries, and I'm looking at the capacity ledger entries. And this is where it's booked the actual time. So that one where I left it after my preparation, quantity 3, and I've produced 117.05 minutes. So that's going to mean I probably have quite an adverse production variance against this. If I go and look at the order statistics, I haven't done the setup in production orders, so production manufacturer, forgive me for that. Again, I'll forgive you for variance, but it would show me in effect, my theoretical cost of production, so capacity would be X, and actually I've got Y, so I've got an adverse variance. So you start understanding whether you're making or losing money on material, or you're making and losing money on actual times, and if so, which which areas of your production are causing that to be an issue. Hopefully I've given you a little bit of idea of how we can take the right technology and put it out there. And it's not expensive. The tablets are relatively cheap. We're not talking about putting Apple iPads out there. We're talking about cheap Android terminals typically. And in fact, some of our customers have used old PCs that they've repurposed from the store cupboard where they were collecting dust because they were too slow for the office. Actually, it doesn't matter. It's just a web browser. So anything you've got with a web browser, you can put on that. It's coming out the cloud, so that you need no software, you need nothing on premise. You can deploy it to as much of your production floor or as little that you want to, and you can set it up very easy. So literally a couple of hours after starting, you can have it set up and in use, recording actual times and actual output that then comes back round to make your planning cycle so much more accurate, because you know whether you're ahead or behind.